The words shattered his empire in an instant. "You are my father," Robert whispered, his manicured hands gripping the conference table as Thomas stood before him, mop still dripping. 35 years of carefully constructed identity collapsed beneath the weight of this janitor's confession. The billionaire's throat constricted as ancestral ghosts danced between them, blood recognizing blood, across an impossible divide. Nothing would ever be the same. Thomas gripped the handle of his mop with weathered hands that had seen decades of labor, his knuckles whitening as he stood before the imposing mahogany door of the CEO's office. The brass nameplate reading Robert Sterling, Chief Executive Officer, gleamed under the artificial lights, mocking him with its polished perfection and the weight of 35 years of secrets that hung between them like an invisible barrier. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in the small, cramped apartment he called home, whispering the words to himself in the darkness of sleepless nights when memories of his past mistakes haunted him like persistent ghosts that refused to fade into the background noise of his existence. The janitor's uniform hung loosely on his frame, a disguise that had allowed him to move invisibly through the corridors of power for the past 6 months, watching from the shadows as his son commanded an empire with the confidence and authority that Thomas could only dream of possessing in another lifetime. The reflection in the polished door showed a man worn down by time and circumstance, silver threads weaving through his once dark hair, lines etched deeply around eyes that had witnessed too much sorrow and not enough joy throughout the tumultuous journey of his life. Thomas had arrived at Sterling Enterprises with a singular purpose that had consumed his every waking moment since achieving sobriety 8 years prior, a purpose that had driven him to transform his broken life with a determination born from the deepest regret imaginable. The janitor's badge that hung around his neck was merely a means to an end, a key that unlocked access to the one person he had sacrificed everything for in a moment of desperate clarity 3.5 decades ago. He drew a shaky breath that seemed to rattle in his chest, feeling the weight of the folded birth certificate tucked safely in his breast pocket, the paper worn thin from years of being unfolded and refolded as he traced the name of the son he had never held. Behind that imposing door, Robert Sterling reviewed quarterly projections with the detached efficiency of a man accustomed to commanding billions with a single decision, unaware that his entire understanding of self was about to crumble beneath the weight of truth. The CEO had built his identity on the foundation of being a self-made man who had risen from the humble beginnings of the foster care system through sheer intelligence and relentless determination, never allowing himself to dwell on the shadows of his unknown origins or the parents who had abandoned him to the system. His corner office overlooked the Chicago skyline, a testament to his victory over the circumstances of his birth. The glass walls, a symbolic representation of the transparency he demanded in business, while his personal history remained shrouded in impenetrable darkness that he had never felt compelled to illuminate. When Thomas finally summoned the courage to knock, the sound echoed through the corridor like a death knell, announcing the end of one reality and the painful birth of another. His heart hammering against his ribs with such force that he feared it might burst through his chest. The voice that called him to enter was confident and commanding, so unlike his own that Thomas momentarily questioned the genetic connection that bound them together across time and circumstance. He pushed open the door with trembling fingers, his gaze immediately finding Robert's face, the face that contained echoes of his own younger self in the shape of the jaw, the slight arch of the eyebrows, the analytical intensity of eyes that now widened in annoyance at the unexpected interruption by a mere janitor. The mop in Thomas's hand dripped silently onto the plush carpet, leaving dark stains like teardrops that marked the path of his approach toward the massive desk that separated father and son. "I apologize for the interruption, Mr. Sterling," Thomas began, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the emotional turmoil that threatened to drown him in its intensity. "But there's something I need to tell you that cannot wait another day." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of decades of absence and the crushing responsibility of truth that Thomas had carried alone for far too long. Robert's expression shifted from irritation to curiosity, as something in the janitor's tone commanded his full attention, perhaps some subconscious recognition of shared blood that transcended conscious understanding. Thomas reached into his pocket with fingers that no longer trembled, withdrawing the birth certificate that connected them across the vast chasm of their different lives, and placed it carefully on the polished surface of the desk that represented everything he had sacrificed for his son to have a chance at a better life than he could have provided during his darkest days. Robert stared at the birth certificate with the same analytical intensity that had dissected countless business proposals, his mind refusing to process the implications of the document that lay before him, like a landmine waiting to detonate the carefully constructed narrative of his life. The elegant fountain pen he had been holding slipped from his fingers and rolled across the mahogany surface, leaving a thin trail of ink that resembled a fault line, a perfect metaphor for the fracture that was rapidly spreading through the foundation of his identity. His throat constricted around words that refused to form, emotions that he had never allowed himself to acknowledge, surging through the cracks in his carefully maintained facade of control and composure that had served him well in boardrooms, but left him woefully unprepared for this moment of raw human connection. "This is impossible," he finally managed, his voice uncharacteristically fragile as he looked up to meet Thomas's gaze, searching for deception or madness, but finding only raw vulnerability that mirrored his own hidden insecurities that he had buried beneath achievements and acquisitions. The resemblance that he had initially dismissed became impossible to ignore as he studied the janitor's face, recognizing the same high forehead and distinctive arch of the eyebrow that greeted him in the mirror each morning. Features that had never before connected to anyone in his isolated existence. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Robert's world tilted on its axis. Everything he had believed about himself suddenly thrown into question by this unexpected revelation that threatened to unravel the very fabric of his carefully tailored existence. Thomas remained silent, allowing the truth to speak for itself through the DNA that connected them across the vast divide of circumstance and choice. His weathered hands, now steady as they rested at his sides in a posture of patience that had been hard-won through years of recovery and atonement. He had not come seeking forgiveness or financial gain, but simply to close the circle that had remained painfully open for 35 years of separation that had shaped both their lives in ways neither could have imagined on that cold Chicago night when he had made the most difficult decision of his life. The weight of unspoken words hung between them like a physical presence, years of birthday wishes never expressed, of triumphs uncelebrated and sorrows unshared, of a father's pride that had been forced to remain distant and a son's questions that had never found answers in the sterile files of the foster care system. Robert's hand moved to the intercom, pressing the button with more force than necessary as he instructed his assistant to cancel all remaining appointments for the day, his voice maintaining a semblance of the authority that was rapidly crumbling beneath the weight of emotional revelations that business school had never prepared him to navigate. The silence that followed was thick with tension and possibilities, with roads not taken and choices that could never be undone, with the complexity of human connections that transcended the clean lines of corporate structure that had defined Robert's existence for so long. He stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the city, where both men had lived separate lives in parallel for months, his reflection superimposed over the skyline like a ghost haunting the monuments to his success. "Why now?" Robert asked, the question emerging as barely more than a whisper that nonetheless carried the weight of decades of absence, and the implicit accusation that Thomas had chosen this moment to disrupt the life his son had built without him. His fingers pressed against the cool glass as if seeking an anchor in the physical world, as the emotional ground beneath him continued to shift unpredictably, threatening the control that had defined his rise to power. The success that had once seemed a testament to his inherent worth now felt hollow in the face of this revelation, a house of cards built on the shifting sands of incomplete identity and unanswered questions that had lurked beneath the surface of his consciousness throughout his meteoric rise to wealth and influence. Thomas crossed the expanse of carpet with measured steps that betrayed his awareness of the chasm that separated them, not just in wealth and status, but in the lost years that could never be reclaimed, no matter how deeply both might wish to turn back the relentless march of time. "Because I had to earn the right to stand before you," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom and the echoes of battles fought against his own demons that had once consumed him so completely that he could not be the father his son deserved. "I needed to become someone you wouldn't be ashamed to know. Someone worthy of the remarkable man you've become despite my absence." The words hung in the air between them, a bridge tentatively extended across an abyss of lost time and missed opportunities, offering not excuses but context for choices made in desperation by a younger man drowning in addiction and poverty who had wanted something better for his child than he could provide. The DNA test results lay on the conference table between them, the clinical language of genetic markers and probability statistics somehow inadequate to express the profound connection they confirmed between two men who had lived as strangers. Robert studied the paper with the same intensity he applied to quarterly reports, as if scientific validation could somehow make the emotional reality easier to process for a mind more comfortable with data than the messy complexity of human relationships that had always remained at arm's length throughout his rise to power. The sterile conference room that had witnessed countless business negotiations now bore silent witness to something far more profound, the reconstruction of identities that had been built on incomplete foundations and the tentative beginnings of a connection that defied the conventional timelines of father-son relationships. Thomas sat across from him, his janitor's uniform exchanged for simple but dignified civilian clothes that spoke of modest means but careful attention, his hands resting on the polished surface with a calmness that belied the emotional turbulence beneath the surface of this moment they had both been moving toward across decades of separation. The past week had passed in a blur of scientific confirmation and cautious conversations, of questions asked and answered with painful honesty that stripped away pretense and left only raw truth between men who shared blood but were still learning how to inhabit the same space without the protective barriers of professional roles and social hierarchies. Every revelation had peeled back another layer of the complex circumstances that had led to their separation. Thomas's struggle with addiction in his youth, the overwhelming poverty, the desperate desire to give his child a chance at something better than the downward spiral he couldn't seem to escape, despite his intelligence and potential. "I looked for you once," Robert admitted, breaking the silence with words he had never spoken aloud, acknowledging the moment of weakness in his early 20s, when success had begun to feel hollow, without understanding the origins that had shaped him. The records were sealed, and I convinced myself it didn't matter, that biology was irrelevant compared to the life I was building. His voice carried the practiced detachment that had served him well in boardrooms, but now felt brittle in the face of the undeniable connection that scientific evidence had confirmed beyond any shadow of doubt. The walls he had constructed around his heart, walls that had protected him through foster homes and the competitive brutality of climbing corporate ladders, now seemed to crack and shift, allowing glimpses of vulnerability that few had ever been permitted to witness in the formidable CEO whose reputation for emotional control was legendary throughout the business world. Thomas nodded, absorbing the revelation with the patient acceptance of a man who had learned through recovery that the past cannot be changed, but only reconciled through honesty and the painstaking work of building something new from the broken pieces of what came before. "I watched you from a distance," he confessed, meeting his son's gaze with eyes that reflected both regret and pride in equal measure. "Once I got clean and found stability. I saw your graduation in the newspaper, your first major acquisition. I kept a scrapbook." The admission hung in the air between them, evidence of a father's love that had existed in silence and shadows, unable to express itself through the normal channels of family connection, but persistent nonetheless across years of separation and the vast differences in their circumstances that might have seemed insurmountable to lesser spirits. Robert's hand moved unconsciously to his temple, fingers pressing against the spot where a persistent headache had taken up residence since the moment Thomas had walked into his office, with truth that couldn't be unheard or dismissed, despite his initial attempts to reject the possibility that had now become undeniable reality. "I built my identity on being self-made, on needing no one," he said, the words emerging with difficulty through the cracks in his carefully constructed persona of complete self-sufficiency that had served as both shield and prison throughout his adult life. The narrative that I succeeded despite being abandoned was powerful. It drove me through nights when everyone else quit, through setbacks that would have broken someone with less to prove. The irony was not lost on either man that Robert's relentless drive, the very quality that had built his empire, had been fueled by the absence that Thomas had created through a desperate act of love that had haunted him across decades of sobriety and atonement. Thomas leaned forward slightly, the movement careful and measured, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture, his weathered face reflecting the accumulated wisdom of hard lessons learned and the peace that comes from accepting responsibility without being crushed beneath its weight. "You succeeded because of who you are, your intelligence, your determination, your vision," he said, voice steady with conviction, born from watching his sons rise from afar, with a pride he had never been able to express until this moment of fragile connection across the polished expanse of corporate furniture that separated them physically, while DNA bound them irrevocably. "Nothing I say can replace the years we lost, and I'm not here to claim credit for the man you've become or to disrupt the life you've built. I simply couldn't die with you, never knowing that you weren't unwanted, that you were the one thing I did right in a life that went terribly wrong for many years." Morning light streamed through the windows of Robert's penthouse, illuminating the two men who sat in contemplative silence over coffee that had grown cold during the hours of conversation that had carried them through the night and into dawn with the relentless momentum of truth too long delayed. Thomas cradled the delicate porcelain between calloused hands that told their own story of labor and perseverance, his gaze taking in the evidence of his son's success with quiet appreciation rather than envy or calculation that Robert had initially expected from this man who had emerged from the shadows to claim paternity. The panoramic view of Chicago spread before them like a living map of possibilities. The city, where their separate journeys had unfolded in parallel, until fate or determination had brought their paths to intersection after 35 years of divergent experiences that somehow needed to be reconciled into something resembling family, despite all conventional timeframes for such connections having long since passed. Robert watched his biological father with the analytical gaze that had assessed countless business associates, searching for similarities beyond the physical resemblance that had become increasingly apparent with each passing day of cautious interaction. He found himself noting Thomas's methodical approach to problem-solving, the quiet intelligence that emerged in their discussions despite formal education, cut short by the circumstances of poverty and addiction that had shaped his early adulthood, before recovery had offered a second chance at building a life of dignity, if not wealth or influence. The discovery that brilliance could exist without credentials challenged Robert's carefully constructed worldview in ways that were simultaneously uncomfortable and expanding, forcing him to reconsider metrics of value that had seemed immutable in the rarefied atmosphere of corporate power, where pedigree and prestigious education had always served as shorthand for potential. "The maintenance supervisor position opens next month," Robert said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them as the city awakened below, his voice carefully neutral despite the significance of what he was suggesting. A bridge between worlds that acknowledged Thomas's dignity without the appearance of charity that would diminish them both. He had spent days considering this offer, weighing the practical implications against the emotional complexity with the same thoroughness he applied to billion-dollar acquisitions, determined to find a path forward that honored truth without pretense or sentiment that neither man would find authentic after lifetimes shaped by pragmatism and the necessity of facing reality without flinching. "Johnson is retiring, and the department needs someone who understands both the technical aspects and the management of people, qualities you've demonstrated in your current role despite its limitations." Thomas considered the offer with the careful deliberation that had become his hallmark in recovery, weighing implications and motivations without the impulsivity that had characterized his youth and led to so many regrettable decisions before sobriety had taught him the value of pause and reflection. "I would need to earn it legitimately," he responded finally, his gaze steady as it met his son's across the breakfast table that had never before hosted family conversations in this space designed for solitary success. No special treatment, no bypassing of qualifications or procedures. "I've learned that shortcuts ultimately diminish what you're trying to build." The words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom and an integrity that had been forged in the crucible of losing everything before slowly rebuilding a life of purpose and meaning from the ashes of former destruction that had nearly claimed him completely before the painful journey toward redemption had begun. Robert nodded, something like respect flickering in his expression as he recognized the pride that mirrored his own, the unwillingness to accept anything unearned that seemed to run in their shared blood, despite the vastly different circumstances that had shaped their respective lives. "The application process will be standard, but your experience and recommendations from your current supervisor will speak for themselves," he assured Thomas, reaching for his tablet to check the time as the responsibilities of Empire continued, despite personal revelations that had altered his understanding of self in ways that were still unfolding in quiet moments between meetings and decisions that couldn't be postponed, despite the seismic shifts occurring in his private life. The boundaries between CEO and janitor remained professionally necessary, even as father and son tentatively explored connection that transcended corporate hierarchy, creating a complexity that both men navigated with careful consideration for propriety and the feelings of others who remained unaware of the biological relationship that had been confirmed by science, but was still being defined through human interaction. Thomas glanced at the framed photographs that lined the bookshelf, visual documentation of Robert's life that he had missed, moments of triumph and recognition captured for posterity, but lacking the presence of family that typically populated such displays in the homes of successful men. "I have no intention of making public claims or disrupting the narrative you've built," he said, addressing the unspoken concern that had hovered beneath their interactions since the DNA test had confirmed what features and mannerisms had already suggested to observant eyes. "This connection is ours to define privately, without expectations or impositions from outside perspectives that couldn't possibly understand the complexity of our situation." Mupu, the words offered reassurance without resentment, acknowledging the legitimate concerns of a public figure whose carefully constructed image could be affected by revelations of biological connection to a man who had spent decades struggling through addiction and poverty before finding stability as a maintenance worker. Robert stood and moved to the window, his reflection superimposed over the city skyline as he considered how profoundly his understanding of success and achievement had been altered by the revelations of recent weeks. How the empire he had built as a fortress against the pain of abandonment now seemed both more and less significant in light of connections that transcended material wealth. "Perhaps we've both been given a second chance," he said finally, turning to face the man who had given him life and then made the painful choice to step away in the desperate hope of offering opportunities he couldn't provide during his darkest days. Not to rewrite the past, that remains unchangeable, but to create something new that honors both where we've been and where we might go from here. The words hung in the air between them, an invitation rather than an expectation, offering possibility without pressure as two men who had survived abandonment and addiction, foster care and poverty, now stood on the precipice of connection that defied conventional timelines, but offered authentic healing that neither had realized they were seeking until truth had shattered comfortable illusions and opened unexpected doors to reconciliation.